I'm Halise Lieberman, and on behalf of the Taube Center, I am pleased to welcome you to this session of TJHT Talks. Our program will run approximately 75 minutes and will be followed by a Q&A session. If you'd like to ask a question or let us know where you're joining us from, please do so in the chat session. And it is now my honor to welcome our guests, Agnieszka Markiewicz, the representative of the American Jewish Committee in Central Europe, Chief Rabbi of Poland, Michael Schudrich, the Honorable Michał Szczerba, member of the Polish Parliament. He is planning to join us, but he has been called away due to the fact that today is a very intense day with the new government, the new prime minister, and the cabinet just being sworn in. Dr. Daniel Tillis, editor-in-chief of Notes from Poland, and our moderator, Shana Penn, executive director of Taube Philanthropies. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being with us. Without further ado, Shana, I add you to the picture. Thank you.
Thank you, Halise, and welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. This webinar series most often addresses historical themes. However, today we have front row seats to breaking news on Poland's new government led by Prime Minister Donald Tusk. The swearing-in ceremony took place this morning, Poland time. President Andrzej Duda of the conservative populist Law and Justice Party presided. And though his party was defeated in the election, the president remains with veto powers. So we'd like to begin with, I'd like to speak with Daniel Tillis to begin with. Daniel, your excellent online news source, Notes from Poland, has covered the elections and is now covering the new government. But let's back up a moment to understand how we got to this historic new chapter. Poland showed that the power of voting can truly cause change. 73% of Poles voted across the country, not just in the big cities, far more than the number that voted in 1989, which brought the downfall of the Communist Party. What's your understanding of how and why the democratic opposition succeeded this time?
Thank you, Shana. Thank you for the invitation to speak today. As you say, this was an historic election for a number of reasons. One of them was, as you say, the absolute record turnout. The previous record high had been in the first semi-free elections, as you mentioned, that brought about or confirmed the fall of communism. But this year we saw even higher turnout. There was huge mobilization. I think there are two general reasons for this, and I'll try not to talk for too long. I know we've got limited time, and I'm happy to hear questions later. But I think above all, this was an anti-peace mobilization. Peace, the Law and Justice Party, have been in power for 8 years. Any government that's had 2 terms and has been in power for that long will start to build up fatigue or even resentment among many voters. No government in democratic Polish history has ever been elected for a 3rd term. So what they were trying to achieve was unprecedented. And in fact, they still won the election in the sense of being the largest single party. So they actually achieved a success in some ways to win the elections after 8 years in power. But they certainly faced fatigue and anger from certain sections of the public. Part of that was just a build-up of various scandals, problems, challenges they'd faced over 8 years. But there were some issues in particular that triggered anger towards the government. I think probably the one above all was the 2020 Constitutional Court ruling that introduced a near total ban on abortion, which triggered, as I'm sure many of our viewers today know, triggered the largest protests Poland has seen since the fall of communism. But also, even more than that, it mobilized a whole, especially a young generation of Poles. For many young Poles, and especially many young Polish women, those protests were, those anti-peace protests were their formative political experience. And within the record turnout figures we saw at the elections in October, there were incredibly high turnout rates among the youngest voters. In fact, turnout among the youngest groups, so 18 to 29-year-olds, was higher than among the oldest groups, so 60 plus, which is just unprecedented. I mean, in almost every country in the world, older voters are more likely to turn out than younger ones. And in Poland, that's always been the case, and usually by a large margin. And among those younger voters, PiS in the previous elections 4 years ago had been the most popular party among young voters. This time it was the least popular party among young voters. So there was this clear shift, and a large part of that was down to the abortion ruling, but also a perception of wider attacks on women's rights, LGBT rights, issues that matter to young Poles in particular. So a big part of this record turnout and the result of the election was an anti-peace vote. The second part was the success of the opposition and their campaign. And I think what that boiled down to in particular was actually, in some ways, almost a failure of Donald Tusk, which was that when Tusk returned to lead his Civic Platform party in 2021, when he came back to Polish politics, for the first almost year and a half of his time in power, he continued a previous tactic of the party, which was try to unite the opposition into a single bloc, ranging from the centre-right to the left, and to stand in the elections on a single list as a single entity opposing peace. That never seemed likely to succeed, both because there wasn't much appetite for it among most of the other parties, but also I feel there wasn't much appetite for it among voters as well. And I think other parties sensed that. And so in the end, the opposition, I think, achieved an optimal balance in the offer that they gave to the Polish electorate. There were three main blocks, which meant they were all large enough to come in above the electoral threshold, the percentage of votes you need to enter parliament. And they offered a clear choice to voters. There was the centrist Civic Coalition led by Tusk. There was the moderately conservative centre-right Third Way grouping led by, in particular, by Szymon Hołownia. And then there was the left that gave more left-leaning voters a choice as well. And so I think those parties made clear that they wanted to form a government together after the election. So voters understood that if they wanted to remove peace from power, they could vote for one of those three opposition groups. But they also understood they had a choice between those three groups. And the group that they favoured, they could help to strengthen and shape the form of the government that would emerge after the elections. So you're muted, Shana, at the moment.
Thank you, Daniel. It's an interesting, unusual coalition of left to center right, and each party has very ambitious leaders. They have to work, it seems they would have to work hard to reach internal understandings, and certainly they have quite an agenda that they promise to achieve against a backdrop of many problems that the peace government had created. So they've promised to restore democratic standards, reverse the previous government's control of the judiciary system, the media, and reproductive rights, among other things. And at the same time, they face a president representing the other party who has veto power. So how do you see how they will work together? What do you see as their challenges?
As you say, this is an extremely broad coalition. So in theory, there's a lot of incompatibility on a number of issues. So I think primarily those differences are in what the Poles call worldview issues, what we may in English call culture war issues. So on all three blocs that are part of the new government coalition, they all agree, for example, that the near total abortion ban should be overturned, but they disagree on how far the law should be liberalized beyond that. So the left want abortion on demand. The more conservative third way want to hold a national referendum and generally favour going back to the previous status quo, which was already one of the strictest abortion laws in Europe. And Donald Tusk's group in the middle have suggested some form of abortion on demand, but have not quite clarified what that means. So that's one area where they're going to disagree. LGBT rights is another one. How far to go in introducing same-sex civil unions, same-sex marriage, and a range of other issues that have been contested, very deeply contested in Poland over the last few years. On the other hand, they have some areas in which they very much agree on improving relations with the European Union, on undoing the overhaul of the judiciary that peace has introduced over the last 8 years, on depoliticizing the public media, which has been turned into a mouthpiece for the government over the last 8 years. So they do have a clear basis to work together. One motivation they also have is that the coalition cannot survive if any group leaves. So if one of the three main blocs leaves, or even if some of the individual parties within those blocks, because those actually three blocks are made up of a number of parties. There's something like 11 or 12 groups that actually make up this government, so it's very broad. If any of them leave, then the government no longer has a majority in parliament. So while they may disagree, and we are likely to see tension, they know that they have to work together. The bigger hurdle is what you suggested, which is the fact that they will have an often hostile president who has the power of veto. So some of what the government wants to achieve, it says it can do without legislation, effectively through decree. So, for example, reversing the near total abortion ban, they claim they can do that without legislation, which would avoid the presidential veto. But there's going to be limits to how far that can go. And so a lot of what they want to achieve will have to be done legislatively, and it's going to be very difficult with a president in office until 2025, which is when presidential elections take place. President in office for at least the next 2 years. Well, he can't stand for another term, but it's possible another peace candidate could be elected after that. So it's going to be very difficult for those 2 years to implement many of the changes that they've promised.
Thank you, Daniel. Michael Schudrich, are you here? I was going to Chief Rabbi of Poland. Michael Schudrich has joined us, but he might have jumped off for a minute. So, Agnieszka, let's talk. Agnieszka, oh, you're back. Great.
Yes, I'll be in about 30 seconds, okay? I'm sorry.
That's okay. Oh, he'll be back in 30 seconds. Okay. Agnieszka, tell us how you're looking at the new government through the lens both of your work with the AJC and also your the board chairperson of the Warsaw Jewish Community Center. What are the people in the JCC thinking about the new election? What are the hopes of the Jewish community as you engage with them?
Well, first of all, good evening, everyone. And Shana, thank you so much for having me tonight with you. Before I answer your questions, if I can allow myself just to add one more thing that came to my mind when I was listening to this really fascinating and very comprehensive overview from Daniel, for which I'm very grateful. I wanted to add one more challenge that this new government is going to face. Well, there's much more than just one, but one especially important. And that is overcoming also, or at least an attempt to deal with the deep polarization of the society. Because as Daniel rightly said, Law and Justice still is the party that got the majority of votes in terms of a single party result. And there is still a very big group of people who would like to see Law and Justice in power, and who, at least to some extent, they stand for what Law and Justice stands for. And we see how deeply, deeply polarized is the Polish society. And I think that's also an issue, very important issue to address, to, on the one hand, introduce reforms and to reverse, I would even dare to say, damage that has been done in many areas, but also not to make the group of voters of Law and Justice feel excluded from the society. I think this is very important to keep in mind. Going back to the question that you have asked, I imagine that many or most of all of you who are with us tonight are people who are somehow interested in Polish-Jewish relations, in Jewish history, in Israel. I mean, you cannot deal with those issues if you're not an optimist, right? So I must say that we are quite optimistic about the new possibilities that open with the new government. It's definitely a fresh start. It's definitely an opportunity. There is certainly a lot of issues that needs to be addressed. We also are very welcome some of the new ministers who are in the cabinet. Some of them who, during the Law and Justice, under the Law and Justice government, have proved to be advocating for issues very important for us. Just to name the new Minister of Justice, Adam Bodnar, who at the time was the ombudsman, and who was very active, for instance, with the issues relating to Holocaust, to distortion of Holocaust history, to anti-Semitism, to protecting the rights of different minority groups. So I think there are many chances here, and we are very eager to see and to cooperate and how it's gonna play out. Definitely, one of the things that at least I would like to flag, and perhaps then we can talk more about it, is the aftermath of the horrible terrorist attack of Hamas on October the 7th. And that, of course, against the backdrop of the Polish-Israeli relations, which in the last few years had been steadily deteriorating, and frankly, were in a very, very bad condition. I guess one of the lowest moments was the amendment of the IPN law, which was penalizing attributing any kind of responsibility for the Holocaust to the Poles. We all know the story, but since then many other things happened that led us to the place where we are. A situation in which, for instance, it's already 2 years that there is no Israeli ambassador, no Polish ambassador in Israel. Excuse me very much. We have an Israeli ambassador in Poland.
Yes, we do.
Thank God. So this is one of the very first things that we would expect from the new government to take care of. We absolutely need very strong and sensitive and determined leadership in terms of Poland's position to the war that Israel is currently conducting. We saw very little reaction, frankly, from the then candidates before the election took place, which is to some extent understandable. To some extent, it's also telling how those issues remain sensitive, politically sensitive in the Polish society. Unlike some other countries in the region who are very vocally supporting Israel, we had, for instance, the Czech foreign minister was the first European leader to go to Israel. And several leaders from the region, they visited Israel in the aftermath of the attack. There was no official delegation to Israel from Poland. There were members of the parliament, and there were some officials who did visit, namely member of the parliament, Michał Szczerba, who I'm still hoping is going to join us, but there was no official delegation. So there are very high hopes and big needs to work together on many issues, Polish-Israeli relations including.
Thank you, Agnieszka. I'd like to come back to some of your points in a moment, but I know that Rabbi Schudrich has limited time too. And welcome, Michael. We're really glad you could be
Hi,
with us.
good evening, good afternoon, good morning.
You know, it was interesting to me that the global Jewish media there was very little coverage of the Polish elections or the new government or the coming into being of this new government in the global Jewish press. It seemed to me the first incident that the Jewish media jumped on was the anti-Semitic incident yesterday at the Parliament, and as if an old story is the news and not the news story of the new government. And Michael, I thought it'd be great if you could comment, tell a little about the incident, and also, I mean, to me it was impressive that every political party seemed to call out this MP for his terrible actions.
Okay.
Anything to add?
I think, well, first of all, that, so I get my flex straight, that's better. We also have to remember that there was very little coverage of the elections. It was 1 week after the war started in Israel. So I think it's a very natural thing that the global Jewish press was focused on what's happening in Israel, what's happening with the hostages, what's happening with so many different things, 1,200 people killed. So I think that's also kind of, I don't know if it would have been different, but certainly it's understandable in the situation that it got pushed way off any kind of coverage. And now that things are not stable in Israel, but it's returning to something like a normal life, that it does make sense. Plus, what happened was completely and utterly outrageous. For the last 17 years, we're lighting the Chanukiah in the presidential palace, which we did Monday night. And about maybe 10 years, 12 years, I don't remember exactly, the Chanukiah is also lit on a different night in the same in the Polish Parliament, which happened last night. And it was just a normal, we've been doing it for years. I was not even there because I was on my Hanukkah travels. I was in Poznan and Wrocław, now I'm in Lublin. And then this far right, pretty much everyone in this country agrees what we would call a far right wacko, went and took a fire extinguisher and blew out the Hanukkah candles. And all political parties, even his own political party, condemned it. And I think equally important from my perspective as a rabbi was the reaction of the Jews there. Because what did we do? We immediately lit the Hanukkah candles again. And that's the story of Jewish history. In some ways, it's also a story of Polish history. People have tried to extinguish us, and we keep relighting the candles. From the time of the original Maccabees, almost 2,200 years ago, till today with Hamas, people are trying to extinguish us, but we don't get extinguished. We keep relighting the candles. Now, once this happened, I knew about this immediately, and so I was thinking, what do we do? What makes sense? What is meaningful? And so I consulted with a friend and decided that we should light, not only that we lit that Chanukiah immediately again, but then also we should have a large second lighting of the Chanukiah in the Polish Parliament, which is exactly what we're doing tomorrow at 4 p.m. Polish time. Rabbi Stambler, the Chabad Shaliach here, and myself wrote a letter to the Speaker of the Parliament, Mr. Holovnia, who's been in the position for about a week now, saying that what happened was horrible. What happened does not represent Poland, and we need to dispel the darkness by bringing more light. We need to light the Chanukiah again. He immediately agreed, and actually, kind of startlingly, in a positive way, read our letter out to the Parliament, because the Parliament had its first meeting of the new government yesterday, and it went on to late at night. And so he actually read the letter to the entire parliament and said, this is a good idea, we need to do it. And you could hear people applauding. And so we know that tomorrow at 4 o'clock, the Jewish community will be there. The Speaker of the Parliament, Halavni, will be there. The Speaker of the Senate will be there. And President Duda is coming. Because even though he urged the presidential palace on Monday, he is coming again for the first time to also light it in the Parliament. Prime Minister Tusk, who's in Belgium and Brussels right now, is sending a representative. And we'll see how many other MPs show up.
Right.
I can also tell you that I've received, I don't remember how many different letters from basically every religious group in Poland. The Community Conscious, which is a group of religious leaders, including the Mufti, is now coming out with a statement condemning what happened. And also, one last piece of that is, and then just normal people, as we say in Hebrew, amcha, the people on the street are also reacting. My wife's mom, my mother-in-law, was getting phone calls from her friends saying, please tell your daughter and her husband that we're outraged. So it's not only political leaders, it's not only religious leaders, it's also the people.
Right. So this political wacko was suspended by his party temporarily. Do you think that are there calls for having him ousted? What do you think will happen to him?
Very hard to say. The problem is they're a very small party. If they lose him, then they go down in, like, there's different levels of position within the parliament. If they lose his participation, then they degrade themselves in their status in the parliament. So unfortunately, self-interest may be overriding a morality in this case. But in the parliament itself, gave him every possible punishment that they could. He's not allowed to speak till the end of this parliamentary session, which is basically till the end of the year. He's lost half of either his salary or his stipend. Whatever they could do, they did. And they also immediately sent a prosecutor to actually bring criminal charges.
Right. What do you think are the advantages and what are some of the concerns you have for this new government as relates to the Jewish community, restitution issues, support of Jewish culture, et cetera? Tell us what you think.
Okay, well, the previous government, the one that just got, is now out of power, actually was not so bad when it came to supporting Jewish cultural events. They probably were no worse and sometimes even better than the previous governments. The great challenge that I always felt with this government was on two issues. One was on historical narrative, that they did not like to talk about anything negative that Poles have ever done in history, and that includes anything against Jews. And for me, what was a very big risk and the most dangerous aspect was the undermining of rule of law. Because while that's not a specifically Jewish thing, any government that undermines rule of law in the end will jeopardize democracy and inevitably will also jeopardize minorities. So I think this government is really looking to bring back rule of law. And Adam Bodnar, as Agnieszka mentioned, is now the new Minister of Justice, is really an outstanding person to do this. He is both a real friend and an incredibly honest man, stood up for what was morally right in a time that was difficult. And I'm very hopeful that he's just the right person we need to help bring back rule of law to Poland.
Thank you, Michael. Would either Agnieszka or Daniel like to comment on the role of the previous government in supporting or not supporting Jewish cultural life including Holocaust scholarship and cultural programs such as at Polin Museum. I mean, there was always seemed to be tension with the last government about what you could and couldn't say and what you would be funded or not funded for.
Shana, I'm just going, as I told you, I'm going to leave you now for 10 minutes. I'm coming right back.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Comments from Agnieszka or Daniel?
Well, I would much rather focus on what's going to happen next, rather than dwell on the period which seems like it's over. I think we more or less know the bad decisions that were taken, and the kind of, in certain spheres, atmosphere that had been created by some of the stakeholders from Law and Justice. Often, I would also say that it was not outright anti-Semitism, but it was using anti-Semitic rhetoric or allowing for it in order for political gain, which doesn't make it much better, if at all. One aspect that I wanted to stress, linked to this, why I am optimistic but cautiously optimistic, is that these were not just political decisions or statements, but it was a process that really did affect the way many people started to think. So, in other words, many people who were involved in Polish-Jewish dialogue and in Polish-Jewish relations felt that many things changed in Poland, changed for the better. That the turning point was the book by Jan Tomasz Gross, The Neighbors, which was a sort of a catharsis during which the Poles confronted some of the darkest moments in its past. And of course, some people rejected it, but many actually understood and drew conclusions from it. And I think that when a few years ago, especially when the IPN law, which I mentioned before, was introduced, many people discovered that we have not actually come as far as we thought, because this denial of certain points of Polish-Jewish past still remains deeply in some parts of the society. And I think that in the past years, the discourse that was promoted, stressing only the heroic sides of Polish history, which, by the way, there are many heroic sides to Polish history, and there is a lot of suffering and victimhood on the Polish side, which does not mean that there is the other side, and admitting this negative side doesn't take away any of the heroism or suffering. But there were many people who fell into the narrative of Law and Justice in that respect. So I think that apart from lifting certain solutions, certain legislations, the legislation had been revised since. We need a deep educational process, and we need to take a look on our textbooks and how we teach history and how we teach about Holocaust, and take some lessons and introduce some changes and make some improvements. And that will be the last thing I'll say before turning to Daniel. We also cannot miss the fact that apart from the, one almost wants to say, good old traditional anti-Semitism, of course it's not good, it's old, but it's not good. We also have all kinds of new forms of anti-Semitism, which we see on the rise also after the Hamas attack of October 7th. And this is something we need to address. We need to address both forms of anti-Semitism. One does not, unfortunately, exclude the other. They're often concern different groups of people, but they also are intertwined and feed one another. So combating anti-Semitism and facing it is one of the challenges for this government, most certainly.
Sorry, Shana, you're muted, but I think you were introducing me there.
Yes, thank you, Daniel.
Yeah, I mean, I really would endorse what both Rabbi Schudrich and Agnieszka have said. Referring back to two things they mentioned, the shocking incident in Parliament yesterday by the far right MP. It was, of course, horrible, but also heartening to, as you say, Shana, to see every single political group in Parliament, including his own, condemning what he did. The immediate reaction from the Speaker to remove and exclude the MP from proceedings, and then his own party's decision today to effectively suspend him for the time being. But as Michael said, there is a big question mark over whether any further action will be taken against him. First of all, because precisely as Michael said, removing him and also other MPs who are part of his faction within this Confederation party that he belongs to would downgrade their status in Parliament, so they will be harming themselves. But also, again, as Michael said, this is not something new. It's been known for years that Grzegorz Braun, the MP in question, has absolutely openly anti-Semitic, extremist, conspiratorial views. He's been one of the foremost promoters of conspiratorial anti-Semitism in Poland over the last decade. This also ties in with anti-LGBT views. He's presented a vision of a Jewish Mason world conspiracy using sodomites, as he calls them, to undermine Polish civilization. So these views, these horrendous views, have been tolerated by his party already. So what he did yesterday may have crossed a line in the sense he brought unwanted attention on them, but the views he expressed and the views that were represented by his actions are nothing new and have been tolerated by his group already. So they may feel that now the negatives outweigh the positives of having him and his supporters in their group, but any such decision would be an entirely cynical one, based on their own interest rather than any moral imperatives. Coming to what Agnieszka was saying, I think this is something that's really important and will change under the incoming government, which is this approach to history that, as Michael said, PiS has been very supportive of many Jewish cultural and religious aspects of life. He mentioned that for the last 17 years, there's been a tradition of lighting the Hanukkah candles in the presidential palace. That was started by President Lech Kaczynski, a PiS president, and has continued under all of his successors since then. But where the area of tension is, as Agnieszka said, is these clashing historical narratives between Poles and Jews, and in particular, the more nationally focused and martyrologically focused narrative of history presented by the outgoing PiS government. And one thing that will change under the new government is big changes in the education system, both in schools and in higher education and research as well. So we're going to see the very political and ideological program that's been introduced in schools over the last 8 years loosened and with more of a focus on a liberal, outward-looking form of education, which part of that is going to be the way history is taught. And then also when it comes to higher education, academia, there's going to be less of the ideological and political pressures that we've seen, especially under the most recent higher education minister. Also, he was the general education minister who's just left in the outgoing government, who was an ultra-conservative figure and a chief promoter of the historical narrative that the PiS government pushed of Polish heroism. And he'd even talked about investigating all academics, the 1,000 or more academics who signed a letter of support for Barbara Engelking, Holocaust scholar, earlier this year, and he talked about cutting funding for those who produce anti-Polish research. And so those kinds of pressures that we've seen in academia and in schools are now going to loosen or disappear under the new government that was sworn in today.
Thank you, Daniel. I want to see if we can address something from one of our audience members, Donald Denham, who's delighted with the election result and hopeful, but also concerned with so many promises. Isn't it better to underpromise and overperform? And I'm wondering, really, if we can look at that for a second, at what is the greatest challenge in such a short four-year term for this new government, which is overhauling the judiciary system. And I'm wondering if any of you have enough knowledge to be able to address this and what this would require.
I can discuss this briefly. I'm not a rule of law expert. It's also a pity we don't have Michał Szczerba, the MP, here today, because
we were hoping he would do.
Yeah, and maybe he still will, but yeah, it's understandable given the momentous events that have been taking place in Parliament this week that he couldn't join us. But no, you as you rightly suggest, Shana, the rule of law and the justice system is going to be the biggest and probably the most difficult challenge that the incoming government faces. They have promised to undo 8 years of policies introduced by the previous government, and that's going to be incredibly difficult because every part of the justice system, from local prosecutors' offices through lower courts to higher courts to the big three courts, the Supreme Court and the Constitutional Tribunal, have all been impacted by these changes in lots of interlinking ways. Just as one example, the National Council of the Judiciary, which is the body responsible for nominating judges in Poland, it was reformed by the peace government in a manner that gave politicians more influence over the institution and over, therefore, the nomination of judges. Those changes have been found by multiple court rulings, both by Polish courts and by European courts, to have rendered that institution illegitimate. And so there's something like certainly over 1,000, but it may be 2,000, I forget, judges that have been nominated by that institution since it was reformed. And in theory, those judges were illegitimately appointed because the body was no longer lawful. Those judges have made thousands of rulings in that period, which again could be regarded as illegitimate. And so simply cancelling those or removing all of those judges is not really an option. So there are going to have to be a lot of difficult decisions, a lot of compromises made, and that's just one area of the chaos that's going to need to be addressed over the coming months and years, and it just gives a taste of some of the difficulties they face. And then one other issue is, which we've already mentioned, is that not only is President Duda able to veto any legislative changes that are pushed through, and he's been a supporter of these judicial reforms over the last 8 years. In fact, he initiated some of them himself. So not only is his veto power there, but the Constitutional Tribunal has a majority of members appointed, and most of those appointed legally by the former, now peace government. They cannot be removed without violating the rule of law by the new government. They're going to be there for some time. They're going to have a majority for some time. And they're also able to declare unconstitutional legislation that's passed by the new government and parliament. So this is going to be an incredibly challenging and difficult process. Oh, you're muted again, Shana.
I'm being so good about muting myself, but forgetting to unmute. Member of Parliament Michał Szczerba will be joining us in about 5 to 7 minutes. It's good news. And we have another question from our participants that I'd like to ask, from Father John Pawlikowski. And greetings to you, Father Pawlikowski. How will the new government relate with the Catholic Church? Would one of you do any of you have an understanding of that, a sense of how that might be? Michael Schudrich, are you here?
Well, I'm no expert on Catholic Church. That's for certain. But I think that from what we heard in the election from the Civic Platform, I think, and what we understand, what is the expectation of the voters of the so-called Democratic Coalition, is a much more clear line and division between the state and the church. I think there is a great expectation for that. Certainly, the degree of this expectation differs among the voters of the respective parties. It's certainly a much more important issue. I would say even one of the most important issues for some of the voters of the left-wing parties. But certainly, we see a shift among the voters from the what is today it's very hard to prescribe party to a traditional political division, but still Civic Platform would be center, by some viewed as center right, by some more center left. But those voters, even though many of them still remain attached to the Catholic Church, they also would like to see more clear lines. And I think it also alludes to what Daniel said in the beginning, the huge issue of the legislation concerning abortion and the and women's rights. It is a crucially important issue. Of course, it's been said by the left-wing parties that they're going to push for a legal abortion without bigger limitations. Civic Platform, as I understand, also supports women's rights to choice, but that is not going to be the case with Szymon Hołownia's party. They declared during the campaign that there would be no party discipline with this regard, that every MP from Szymon Hołownia party would make this personal choice. But we shall see. I don't know to what extent it answers the question of John Pawlikowski. I'm sure there is much more that can be said about it, especially by Rabbi Michael Schudrich. But I also wanted to stress the very important voice. I'm not sure if Rabbi Schudrich mentioned it. The voice coming from the Catholic Church yesterday after the incident in the Parliament. If I believe it was Bishop Ryś who apologized in the name of the Polish Catholic Church to the Jews, which was very important, I think, and much appreciated.
Thank you, Agnieszka. We have another good question from Michael Nutkiewicz, asking us to go deeper into the EU. How can the EU play a significant role in supporting the Civic Coalition?
Well, I mean, I think certainly the EU isn't going to want to be seen to be supporting any political party, but I understand the meaning behind the question, which is that certainly the EU, Brussels, welcomes the change in government. It's had 8 years of, to say the least, very difficult relations with the former government, and things are now likely to improve. The big question is over unlocking billions of euros in funds that have been frozen by Brussels. This is the EU's post-pandemic recovery fund, which has been paid out to other EU countries, but Poland's funds have been frozen due to rule of law concerns, in particular concerns over the independence of the judiciary as a result of the reforms of the PiS government. And unlocking those funds is not going to be as easy as simply a change in government. There are going to have to be, and the EU has made this clear, there are going to have to be concrete steps taken by the new Polish administration to undo the changes that caused the problem in the first place. And as I mentioned a moment ago, undoing many of those changes will be difficult. But I think what the noises from Brussels and Warsaw from the incoming ruling camp have suggested is that some of this will be done on trust, that if the EU sees things are heading in the right direction, even if not every single change that's required has been made, then they will start to unlock those funds. And this is a huge amount of money that is going to be a big boost to Poland's budget. And so I think the EU is going to have to tread a difficult line between maintaining the milestones, as they were called, that were agreed with the previous peace government to unlock the funds, but also showing some goodwill and flexibility with the new government to understand that not all of these problems can be solved quickly, and that it's the direction of travel which is as important as achieving every outcome straight away.
Thank you, Daniel. We have another question, comment from Fred Feldman. Maybe Rabbi Schudrich, you'd like to, or Agnieszka, or all of you actually might want to address this. Has anti-Semitism and violence increased dramatically in the world even before the war with Hamas? And is concerned about the 30s repeating itself. Any comments?
Well, can I start?
Yes, please.
Okay, so actually, first, it hasn't. Anti-Semitism since the war has gone up a tiny bit, but unlike many other places, we're much more aware of security. Thank God. And as we say, yeah, poo, nothing is.
Michael, you're going in and out. Michael, it's hard to hear you. I'm going to ask, Michael, it's very hard to hear you, so I'm going to ask Agnieszka to speak. And Fred, we're not talking about the US here, we're talking about Poland. Okay, Agnieszka?
No. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. Someone was trying to call me, so I apologize. I haven't figured out how to be online and not to get phone calls. Someone will have to teach me that eventually. So, the synagogue and other Jewish facilities are much more aware now of security, but very fortunately, nothing has happened so far. Why? It's hard for me to decipher. It certainly has to do with the fact that we don't have a large Muslim community, a large foreign Muslim community in Poland. That's certainly, very sadly, one of the reasons. The other reason is that we've worked for 20 years to have a good relationship with our local Muslim community, and we do. When I held a public prayer in response to the Al-Aqsa Day, the Day of Rage, we had Muslims who came and participated in our prayer for peace. Are the 30s repeating itself? Certainly not in Poland right now. Some of the far left have been saying some nasty things, but if you compare it to any other countries, particularly the United States, it's way less. And the other thing is, it's different now. And that's, we have the State of Israel, we have the IDF. And that means we're really in a very different situation than we were in the 30s. Agnieszka, Daniel?
Thank you.
Daniel? I am a bit less optimistic than Rabbi Schudrich. Because what we observe is Poland catching up with the West in the ways that I would hope we would not see. And what I mean by that is, of course, the approach to Israel and the view of Israel and the view of the current situation, especially among the liberal elites, people who traditionally do not have anti-Semitic views, who actually would be vocal about anti-Semitism as we refer to the Law and Justice period in the past 8 years, but who present views that are anti-Semitic with regards to Hamas, with regards to the situation in Israel. And that is a phenomena that, in my opinion, is only going to continue in Poland, unfortunately. That does not mean that the 30s are repeating itself, but I think it means that there is a huge, huge work to be done and a huge need of education and advocacy, because this new form of anti-Semitism is going to prevail, and it is very dangerous.
I certainly do agree with that we do have a huge need for advocacy and for education. And it's constantly, I've spent now 2 months trying to engage with all kinds of people who are articulating statements what I consider anti-Semitic, when I know they're not anti-Semitic, when they have never exhibited anti-Semitism before, and trying to help them understand, or trying to understand where they're coming from, and for them to understand where we're coming from, and to see the mistakes that they're making. Of course, I'm making it very nice. It's not simple at all. There are some people who were probably anti-Semitic all along, and now it's coming out. That's also true. But it's certainly not a situation without hope. It's also that Hamas and these other terrorist organizations have spent a couple of decades pushing their agenda. And the other place where it's very much an imbalanced fight is that they simply, to put it in simple terms, they lie. They make up stories. I refuse to make up stories to bolster my side. So if we want to continue to be honest and moral in the way we explain things, it does put us at, I don't know a better word than a disadvantage, but it's a disadvantage that I want, because of this dishonesty, not of the Arabs, not of the Palestinians, but of Hamas, Hezbollah, terrorist organizations.
Well, thank you for that, Michael. And thank you, Agnieszka and Daniel and Michael, for all of your remarks and comments today. Very enlightening. I think three of the takeaways are, this is a very exciting new chapter in Polish politics and Polish society, and we will have to revisit some of these issues as the time goes on. How will this new coalition work together? What are the challenges of trying to overhaul the judiciary system and reinstituting an independent media and reproductive rights? The polarization in society does not necessarily get improve in a new chapter like this, and we can see that in the United States. So we hope to learn some positive tactics from Polish citizens in overcoming polarization, and then finally the Poland resuming a leadership role in the EU. It's a very important time for Poland to be an active part of the EU, and particularly in support of Ukraine. So I'm very sorry that MP Szczerba could not join us today. We'll have to have him back another time to help answer some of these questions. And I want to turn it over to Halise Lieberman.
Shana, thank you. I want to thank Rabbi Schudrich, Daniel Tillis, and Agnieszka. We too are disappointed that Michał Szczerba could not join us, but I want to assure you that not only will the guests we had today reappear in the months to come with TGHT Talks sessions, but we hope to have Michał on board as well to help address some of these questions and think about what's happening in the next months as progress is being made. and we do address some of these questions. Your insights, your perspectives are very welcome, and we look forward to sharing more. In the future, there are other questions, and Shana brought this up in terms of the war in Ukraine, among others. And we hope here at TJHT Talks, we're very grateful that you've joined us and that you will continue to join us in the new year as we bring you monthly updates and insights into Polish Jewish life, history, and culture. In the meantime, we wish all of you a happy Hanukkah if you're celebrating, and may the winter holidays be full of peace and light. Good night. Thank you.
Night.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.